Okay, so I'm going to pick up where I left off in talking about the five denominational views of the Lord's Supper. I know that we have already addressed the memorialist view as well as we got into the Catholic view and the Orthodox view. So I'm just going to run through a couple of these very quickly, and I'll spend a little bit more time talking about some of these in more detail. So, with the Catholic view, just to review on this one, the Catholic view of the Lord's Supper, they're going to refer to it as the Eucharist. They would reference the Lord's Supper as being a sacrament, which means it does convey grace. So, when you eat the bread, when you drink the wine or the juice, there is actually spiritual grace which is present when you take these physical elements. They refer to this action as transubstantiation. Transubstantiation means that there is a change which occurs to the substance of the elements. The bread and the wine are actually going to change completely into the actual body and blood of Christ. They will explain this change as it occurs to the bread and wine as happening upon consecration. So the priest will pray over the elements, and after that prayer of consecration, the elements have actually changed. So the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. They refer to this as the real presence. And at the Council of Trent in 1545 to 1563, they identified this. Remember, the Council of Trent comes after the Luther's Protestant Reformation, and they settle into this point very firmly that the bread and wine are the actual body and blood of Christ. Now, what's interesting is that every single denomination is going to say that Christ is present inside of the celebration, but where he is present is going to be slightly different. So for a Catholic Mass or the Eucharist, they're going to refer to that as the real presence, that Christ is really present inside of the bread and wine. I know we got into the Orthodox view a little bit, so let's go over this as well. They also would refer to this as the Eucharist. Remember, the Orthodox Church was actually a split of the Catholic Church, very similar in many of its teachings, but very distinct in its teachings as well. Much more of an emphasis on the Trinity in this denomination. But they refer to the Eucharist as the sacrament of sacraments. If you go to Catholic Mass, or if you go to an Orthodox Mass, you will see the whole purpose, the whole point of what's going on in that service is the celebration of the Eucharist. They are there for that reason. Everything in the church, in the Orthodox Church, is going to lead to the celebration of the Eucharist. Everything flows from it. All things flow from it. All things lead to it. They consider this to be the source and the goal of all church doctrines and institutions. So they consider this to be the most important element of their church service. Now, just like in the Catholic Church, they're going to consider the bread and wine to actually physically change into the body and blood of Christ. They will also refer to it as the real presence of the body and blood of Christ, but they won't explain it as happening upon consecration. They will say that it occurs by mystery. And this mystery in which they say the bread and wine mysteriously become the body and blood of Christ. So they don't give an explanation for it. They say that it defies analysis, it defies explanation, it doesn't fit in rational and logical terms that we're used to here on earth. So the Eucharist, as is Jesus Christ, is a mystery. This is a mystery of the kingdom of heaven. They'll say there are things that we don't understand about Jesus, and there are things that we don't understand about the Eucharist, and that's okay. It's not of this world. It's something we enjoy in this world, but it's not something that we necessarily will understand completely. The Eucharist, because it belongs to God's kingdom, is truly free from the earthborn logic of fallen humanity. So they say we don't have the capacity to understand it. We don't have the ability to understand this on our own. All right, let's move on to the next denomination we're going to look at, which is the Lutheran Church. They will typically refer to the Lord's Supper as communion. You may hear the term Eucharist used, but more associated with the term communion. And they're not going to say that it conveys grace in the same way that the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church would. They believe that this is a commemoration of the Last Supper. So it's a little bit closer to the memorialist view, which is saying it's a remembrance of Jesus Christ. So this is a liturgical commemoration of the Last Supper, which means it is a prescribed practice of the church, which is meant to remember what happened at the Last Supper. Now, with the bread and wine, they use a slightly different word. With the Catholic Church, we use the term transubstantiation. Okay, transubstantiation, which means that the bread and wine actually change into the actual body and blood of Christ. With the Lutheran Church, they refer to it as consubstantiation. Consubstantiation doesn't say that there's actually a physical change to the bread and wine. It's still bread and wine, but they say there is a union with Christ with the wine and the bread. And what they mean is that Christ's body and blood are present in, with, and under the forms of bread and wine. Martin Luther, who starts the Lutheran Church, did not actually use this term. This was adopted later. He would have been closer in the interpretation of the Catholic Church with the practice of the Eucharist. So for a Lutheran, they're going to say that Jesus is present in this celebration, but it is still bread and wine. Those two elements haven't changed. It's just that Jesus is present in, with, and under the bread and the wine. So he's around it. He's around these elements. All right, we talked about the memorialist view. The memorialist view is going to typically refer to it as Lord's Supper or Holy Communion. They emphasize that this is a remembrance only. The bread and wine do not change. So this is meant to remember Christ's suffering and also to remind us that he has the power to overcome sin and death, which he did on the cross. So as a memorial, they're going to deny that there is any form of physical or spiritual presence of Christ in the bread and wine. But like I said, every denomination believes that Jesus is present in this celebration. With the memorialist view, they're going to say nothing happens to the bread and wine. It remains bread and wine. There's nothing that changes about it. The physical substance is the same. But Christ is present in the gathering of the believers. So they're not going to say there is a real physical presence of Christ. They're going to say there is a spiritual presence of Christ. It's not in the elements. It's in the hearts of the believers that are present there. All right, the last denominational view that we'll look at is the Reformed view. And the Reformed view is going to refer to the Lord's Supper as that Christ is not physically present inside of the elements, but he is spiritually present. So rather than say there's a real physical presence, they're going to say there's a real spiritual presence of Christ inside of the elements. So if you go to a Reformed church, if you go to a Presbyterian church or a Reformed church, they're not going to say that the bread and wine actually change. They're going to say these are actually just bread and wine. Those who receive the bread and wine with faith can actually receive the actual body and blood of Christ through the power of the Holy Spirit. And this is happening through the sacrament, through this action of eating the bread and the wine. This is known as receptionism. So we got three big terms through all of these. We've got transubstantiation, which means that the bread and wine actually change into a new substance. We've got consubstantiation, which means that Christ is present in, with, and under the elements, so he's all around them. And then you've got receptionism, which is the believer is actually receiving Jesus Christ by eating the bread and wine, but it is happening spiritually. John Calvin talked about this in his series of theological works called the Institutes. He says, the rule which the pious ought always to observe is whenever they see the symbols instituted by the Lord, to think and feel surely persuaded that the truth of the thing signified is also present. For why does the Lord put the symbol of his body into your hands, but just to assure you that you truly partake of him? If this is true, let us feel as much assured that the visible sign is given us in a seal of an invisible gift, as that his body itself is given to us. So what Calvin is saying is, why would Christ give us the symbol of the Lord's Supper or of the Eucharist if we weren't also to feel, if he commands us, which he does, to continue this action? Why would he put this symbol in our hands if we weren't able to actually partake of him through this symbol? And so Calvin is saying there is a real there is a real transference of Christ to the believer in this action, and we are actually getting a visible sign of this, of an invisible gift that's being given to us. Okay, that's what I've got for the 5 views of the Lord's Supper. You can go ahead and move on to the next step in your assignments for today.